The universe has a sick sense of humor. FBI Special Agent Mara Murphy had spent 15 months hunting Gattuso Hawk across 3 continents, and destiny chose to crash their plane on an unmapped jungle island, just the two of them. 30 miles of hostile wilderness, and the slowly dying hope that rescue would arrive before she had to choose between her badge and her survival. The impact drove every thought from her mind except one: survive. When consciousness crawled back, bringing with it the copper taste of blood and the suffocating humidity of jungle air, Mara's training kicked in before her vision cleared. Assess injuries, secure perimeter. Account for survivors. Her ribs screamed, her left shoulder hung wrong, but she could move. She had to move. The wreckage was a grotesque sculpture of twisted metal and shattered dreams, smoke still rising from sections that had burned themselves out. Bodies hung in trees, scattered across the clearing like discarded dolls. Mara counted 7 she could see, all still, all silent. Then she heard movement, debris shifting 20 yards away. Her hand instinctively reached for her weapon, finding only torn fabric and bruised skin. She'd lost everything in the crash. Everything, except her cover identity and her mission. Mara forced herself upright, biting back a groan, and moved toward the sound with the predatory caution of someone who'd spent 3 years learning to hunt apex predators. The man extracting himself from a cluster of seats was unmistakable, even covered in ash and blood. Gattuso Hawk, 6 feet of controlled lethality, wrapped in a now-ruined Brioni suit, wiped debris from his aristocratic face with steady hands. Those hands had signed execution orders. Those hands had built an empire on calculated violence. Those hands were now the only other living things on this godforsaken island. His dark eyes found hers, sharp and assessing despite the gash above his eyebrow. For one crystalline moment, they stared at each other across the wreckage. FBI agent and mafia king, hunter and prey. The only 2 souls fate had been cruel enough to spare. "You're injured," he said in that low, accented voice she'd studied from surveillance recordings. Italian sophistication layered over something harder, something earned in Sicily's brutal proving grounds. "I'll live." Mara kept her voice neutral, channeling her cover Emma Walsh, marine biologist, harmless academic. "You're bleeding." "I've had worse." He moved toward her with surprising grace for a man who'd just survived a plane crash, his gaze never leaving her face. "How many others?" "None." The word tasted like ash. "I checked. We're it." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Gatto Hawk wasn't a man accustomed to being vulnerable, to needing anyone. The universe had just forced the world's most wanted criminal to depend on the agent sent to destroy him. And she couldn't let him know. Not yet. Not while they were stranded together with survival measured in days, not hours. "Then we should establish shelter before dark," Gatto said, his tone shifting to command, the natural authority of a man who'd ruled criminal empires since his father's assassination. "The smoke will attract attention, wildlife, or worse." Mara wanted to refuse, to establish dominance, to remind him that she wasn't one of his subordinates. But her training overrode her pride. Survival first, justice later. She nodded once, sharp and efficient. "Agreed. But I'm not taking orders from you." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something dangerous. "I wouldn't dream of it, Dr. Walsh." The way he said her cover name made her blood run cold. He knew something was wrong. 3 months earlier, Assistant Director Kovac had dropped the file on Mara's desk with the weight of a death sentence. Gattuso Hawk, 2nd-generation boss, 1st-generation nightmare. His father built the empire, but Gatto perfected it. Interpol wants him. Rico wants him. Half of Europe wants him. Nobody can touch him. Mara had opened the file, studied the surveillance photos. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, a face that belonged on magazine covers instead of wanted posters. "Why me?" "Because you're hungry, Murphy. Because your grandmother didn't cross the Atlantic so her granddaughter could play it safe. Because when you want something, you don't stop until it's done." Kovac had leaned against her desk, his expression grave. "And because I need someone who won't be seduced by the romance of it all." Hawk's not some street thug. He's educated, sophisticated, speaks 5 languages. He's dangerous precisely because he doesn't look it. She'd studied the file for 6 days straight, memorizing patterns, building profiles, tracking his network across financial channels and shipping routes. 15 months of surveillance, 3 near misses, and finally she'd gotten him on that plane. Now here she was, watching that same dangerous man strip branches with efficient, economical movements, building a shelter framework with the casual competence of someone who'd done hard labor despite the expensive suits. "You're doing it wrong," Mara said, unable to help herself. Her shoulder throbbed, but her pride hurt worse watching him waste energy on a design that wouldn't hold against rain. Gatto paused, one dark eyebrow rising. "Forgive me, Dr. Walsh. I didn't realize marine biology included wilderness survival. My father was a contractor in Cork before we emigrated. I grew up on construction sites. The lie came easily. She'd built this cover for months. That angle won't support the weight when the leaves get wet. You need cross-bracing." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, assessing. Then, surprisingly, he adjusted the framework exactly as she'd suggested. "Show me." It wasn't a request. It was a test. Mara moved to the shelter, ignoring her protesting ribs, and demonstrated the proper technique for lashing supports. Her hands worked automatically, muscle memory from actual wilderness training at Quantico, overriding the biographical fiction of her cover. When she finished, Gatto was watching her hands, not her face. "Your father taught you well," he said quietly. Something in his tone suggested he didn't quite believe her, but he let it pass. "We'll need water before nightfall." There was a stream approximately half a kilometer southwest based on the terrain gradient. "You can tell that from here?" Despite herself, Mara was impressed. "I can tell many things, Dr. Walsh." He gathered the torn fabric from seat cushions, fashioning a crude water carrier with the same efficiency he'd shown building shelter. "My father believed survival skills were essential education, even for those who would never need them." His mouth twisted slightly. Turns out he was right. They worked in tense silence, building a shelter that was more functional than comfortable, a temporary fortress against the coming night. Mara found herself falling into rhythm with him. He'd start a task, she'd refine it, he'd adapt without argument. It was infuriating how well they worked together, how his tactical precision mirrored her own training, how he anticipated her movements the same way she'd learned to anticipate his patterns from months of surveillance. "You're not what I expected," Gatto said as the sun began its descent, painting the jungle canopy in shades of blood and gold. Mira's pulse quickened. "What did you expect?" "Someone less." He paused, selecting his words with the same care he'd shown selecting branches. "Competent. Most civilians would be hysterical by now. I'm not most civilians. The truth, for once." "No," he agreed, those dark eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "You're not." The jungle around them began its evening chorus, screams and clicks and rustles that promised they weren't as alone as they'd thought. Mara felt the weight of her deception pressing against her chest, heavier than any injury. She was alone on an island with the most dangerous man she'd ever hunted, and he was starting to suspect she wasn't who she claimed to be. By the fourth day, Mara had stopped counting hours and started counting heartbeats. Time moved differently in the jungle, measured in the rhythm of foraging for edible plants, the careful rationing of water from the stream, the constant vigilance against the island's endless threats. She'd seen snakes thick as her arm, spiders the size of her hand, and something large moving through the underbrush at dusk that neither of them wanted to identify. Gatto proved unnervingly capable. He identified poisonous plants with the same confidence he'd probably once identified enemies, tested water sources with methodical precision, and never wasted energy on unnecessary movement. Mara found herself watching him when she shouldn't, the economical way he worked, the controlled strength in his movements, the sharp intelligence behind every decision. The file had prepared her for the criminal. It hadn't prepared her for the man. They'd established an unspoken system. He hunted, setting snares with professional efficiency that made her wonder where a mafia boss learned wilderness trapping. She gathered, identifying edible roots and leaves with knowledge that probably exceeded her marine biologist cover. Neither questioned the other's suspicious competence. The island didn't care about their secrets. "Storm coming," Gatto said on the evening of the fifth day, studying the sky with the same intensity he studied everything. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, pregnant with violence. Mara felt it too, the pressure drop, the sudden stillness in the air, the way the jungle seemed to hold its breath. "We should reinforce the shelter." They worked frantically as the first drops fell, weaving palm fronds tighter, securing their meager supplies. The storm hit with tropical fury, rain like bullets, wind that threatened to tear their shelter apart, thunder that shook the ground. Water poured through gaps they'd missed, soaking everything, turning their refuge into a cold, miserable cave. Mira's teeth started chattering within an hour. The temperature had dropped viciously, and her wet clothes clung to her skin like ice. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to conserve heat, but her body was already shutting down, shivering so hard her injured ribs screamed. "You need to remove those clothes." Gatto's voice cut through the storm's roar. "Excuse me?" Mira's chattering made the indignation less effective. "Wet fabric will kill you faster than the cold. Remove them, wring them out, then we share body heat." His tone was clinical, detached. "Unless you'd prefer hypothermia." "I'm fine," Mira lied, but another violent shiver betrayed her. Gatto moved closer, and she saw he'd already removed his ruined shirt, his torso lean and marked with scars that told stories she'd never read in any file. "Dr. Walsh, I've seen men die from stubbornness. Your pride is not worth your life." He was right. She hated that he was right. With shaking hands, Mira peeled off her soaked jacket and shirt, wringing them out with as much dignity as she could muster in her sports bra. The cold bit harder without the wet fabric, but Gatto was already moving behind her, his body heat radiating like a furnace. "This is purely practical," he said, and she felt his chest against her back, his arms wrapping around her middle with careful, respectful placement. Nothing more. But it was more. It was everything Mira had trained herself not to feel. His warmth seeped into her shivering muscles, his steady heartbeat against her spine, the subtle scent of him smoke and survival, and something darker she couldn't name. This close, he wasn't the criminal mastermind from surveillance footage. He was human, solid, alive. "Why aren't you cold?" she asked, desperate for distraction from the intimacy. "I am. I'm just better at hiding it." His breath stirred her wet hair. "My father believed showing weakness was invitation for betrayal, so I learned not to show it. Sounds like a terrible way to live. It kept me alive." A pause. Until it didn't keep him alive. Mira shouldn't care about the pain in his voice. She shouldn't wonder about the boy who'd learned to hide his cold, his fear, his humanity. She definitely shouldn't notice how perfectly she fit against him, how her breathing synchronized with his, how safe she felt in the arms of the man she was supposed to destroy. The storm raged outside, but inside their shelter, wrapped in the warmth of her enemy, Mara Murphy felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. The snake strike happened so fast, Mara barely registered it. One moment Gatto was reaching for wild papaya, the next he jerked back with a sharp intake of breath, cradling his forearm. The serpent disappeared into the undergrowth, leaving behind 2 puncture wounds that wept blood. "Let me see." Mara grabbed his arm before he could protest, her training overriding everything else. The wounds were clean but deep, already swelling. What did it look like? Green, banded. His voice was steady, but sweat had broken out across his forehead. Triangular head. Pit viper. Possibly lethal without antivenom. Mara's mind raced through protocols she'd learned at Quantico's survival course. "We need to immobilize the arm. Keep your heart rate down. Don't move." "I'm fine," Gatto said, but his hand trembled as he tried to pull away. "You're not fine. Sit down before you fall down." She guided him to a fallen log, noting how his breathing had already become labored. The venom was working fast. "I need you to stay calm. Panic will spread it faster." For the first time since the crash, she saw fear flicker in those dark eyes. Not fear of death, but fear of losing control. She understood that fear intimately. Mara worked quickly, tearing fabric to create a pressure bandage, keeping the wound below his heart. But as minutes stretched into hours, the venom's effects intensified. Gatto's arm swelled grotesquely, his skin burning with fever. The iron control he maintained like armor began to crack. "My father died because of me," he whispered during the worst of it. Delirious with fever, his walls finally crumbling. "I was 19. Too young, too arrogant, too certain I knew better. Made a deal without his approval. They killed him to teach me respect." His hand found hers, gripping with desperate strength. "I never wanted this empire, this crown of blood and violence. But men like me don't get to choose. We inherit sins and call it legacy." Mara pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her throat tight. This wasn't the monster from the file. This was a boy who'd been forced to become a king he never wanted to be. "My grandmother worked 3 jobs so my mother could go to school," she heard herself say, the truth slipping out unbidden. "My mother worked 2 jobs so I could have choices she never did. They crossed an ocean, so I could be anything I wanted." She swallowed hard, And what did I choose? A career built on judgment and distance. I'm good at seeing people as cases, as problems to solve. I forgot how to see them as human. Gatto's fevered eyes focused on her face with sudden clarity. You're not a marine biologist. Mara's heart stopped. The fever's making you confused. No. His thumb traced over her knuckles, calloused in the wrong places, scarred from weapons training no academic would have. You're something else. Someone trained to survive, to hunt, to hide in plain sight. He smiled weakly. Just like me. The confession hung between them, dangerous and inevitable. Mara should deny it, reinforce her cover. Instead, she kept holding his hand as the fever raged, as the truth stretched thin between them, as the distance between hunter and prey collapsed into something neither of them could name. Gatto survived the venom. 3 days of fever, delirium, and pain that would have broken most men. But on the morning of the 4th day, his eyes cleared and the swelling began to recede. Mara had barely left his side, monitoring his breathing, changing his bandages, forcing water between his cracked lips. She told herself it was pragmatic, she needed him alive to survive this island. But the terror she'd felt watching him fight for each breath had nothing to do with pragmatism. You saved my life, he said on the evening he could finally sit upright without assistance. The jungle sunset painted his face in shades of amber and shadow, highlighting the sharp angles that had become achingly familiar. Don't read too much into it. You're my only resource for getting off this island. The lie tasted bitter. Liar. He said it without accusation, almost with tenderness. You care, Dr. Walsh. Or whoever you really are. You care despite every instinct telling you not to. Mara's carefully maintained composure fractured. You don't know anything about me. I know you move like someone trained for violence. I know those hands have held weapons, not test tubes. I know you read terrain like a soldier and assess threats like someone who's faced them professionally. Gatto shifted closer, his recovered arm reaching up to trace the line of her jaw with devastating gentleness. I know you watch me when you think I'm sleeping. And I know you hate yourself for it. Stop. But she didn't pull away. Why? Because acknowledging this thing between us makes it real? His thumb brushed her lower lip, and Mara's breath caught. It's already real, Bella. It's been real since we woke up in that wreckage and realized fate had played its cruelest joke. You're my... She stopped, the word target dying on her tongue. What was he now? Enemy? Ally? The man whose fevered confessions had revealed depths no surveillance file could capture? I'm your what? Gatto's dark eyes held hers, searching, seeing too much. Your assignment? Your case? Your moral dilemma? He leaned closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin. Or am I the first person in your carefully controlled life who sees past the armor to the woman underneath? This is wrong, Mara whispered, even as her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch. Everything about us is wrong. We're strangers who know each other's secrets, enemies who trust each other with our lives. Survivors of a disaster that should have killed us both. His forehead touched hers, intimate and devastating. So, tell me your name, your real name. The one you haven't spoken since you boarded that plane. Mara. It escaped like a confession, like surrender. Mara Murphy. Mara, he repeated, tasting each syllable. Irish. First generation, like me. Fighting to prove yourself worthy of the sacrifice your family made crossing that ocean. His hand cupped her face with unbearable gentleness. We're not so different, you and I. We're nothing alike, she protested weakly. You're a criminal. You're FBI. He said it calmly, matter-of-factly, as if he'd known all along, probably assigned to my case. Definitely the reason you were on that plane. He smiled slightly at her sharp intake of breath. Did you think I wouldn't recognize a hunter when I saw one? I've been prey long enough to know the look. Mara should run, should retreat, should rebuild the walls he'd systematically demolished. Instead, she stayed frozen in his touch, terrified and exhilarated. I should arrest you, she said, the words hollow even to her own ears. With what authority? What jurisdiction? Gatto's smile turned sad. We're beyond that now, Mara Murphy. Beyond duty and law and all the rules we lived by. There's only this island, this moment, and the choice we make right now. When he kissed her, it felt like falling and flying simultaneously, inevitable and impossible, wrong and necessary, the end of everything she'd been and the beginning of something she couldn't name. Mara kissed him back with 15 months of obsession transformed into something far more dangerous than duty. She was in love with the man she'd sworn to destroy. And God help her, she didn't know how to stop. They sat by the fire that night, the kiss still burning between them like the embers at their feet. Mara's world had tilted on its axis, and she didn't know how to right it. Everything she'd believed, every certainty she'd built her life upon, felt suddenly negotiable. "You want to know who I really am," Gatto said finally, his voice low and measured. "Not the file version, not the surveillance footage or the intelligence reports. The truth." Mara's throat tightened. "I think I need to." He stared into the flames, and in the flickering light, she saw the weight he carried heavy as iron, ancient as blood. "My father, Lorenzo Hawk, built an empire on suffering. Drugs, trafficking, extortion, the kind of evil that metastasizes through communities like cancer." His jaw clenched. "I was raised in that darkness, groomed to inherit it. And when they killed him for my mistake, I had no choice but to take the throne." "So you became him," Mara said quietly. "No," the word cracked like a whip. "I became something else entirely." Gatto turned to face her, his eyes fierce with conviction. "I took his organization and burned it from the inside out. Every trafficking route dismantled, every drug pipeline destroyed, every operation that preyed on the vulnerable eliminated." Mara's mind reeled. "That's not what the intelligence says. Intelligence sees what I want them to see. A criminal empire that still operates, still generates revenue, still maintains power." A bitter smile crossed his face. "But my business now consists of hunting the real monsters, the cartels that traffic children, the syndicates that deal in fentanyl and death, the networks that make my father's operation look like petty theft." "You're telling me you're some kind of vigilante?" Skepticism warred with the dangerous hope blooming in her chest. "I'm telling you I'm using the devil's tools to fight the devil's work." Gatto leaned forward, intensity radiating from him. "You want proof?" "The Kozlov Syndicate. They moved 12 million in blood diamonds, funding paramilitaries in Africa. I dismantled them, made it look like internal warfare. Your FBI took credit, never knowing I'd fed them the evidence." Mara's breath caught. She remembered that case. It had been a career-defining win for the Bureau. The Serpent Ring in Southeast Asia child trafficking operation serving the world's elite. 3 years ago, every major player died in what looked like a territorial dispute. His voice turned cold. "I killed them myself. Every single one." "That's not justice," Mara whispered, but the protest felt hollow. "That's murder." "Justice?" Gatto laughed without humor. "Justice is 13-year-old girls returned to their families because I burned that operation to ash. Justice is the tons of poison that never reached American streets because I sank those ships myself. Your precious system, with its warrants and jurisdictions and bureaucracy, can't touch these people. They're too powerful, too connected, too protected by borders and bribes." He reached out, taking her hand with surprising gentleness. "So yes, Mara Murphy, I'm a murderer. I'm a criminal. I operate outside every law you've sworn to uphold. But I'm also the only thing standing between the world and monsters that would make your nightmares seem tame." Mara pulled her hand away, standing abruptly, pacing the small clearing. Everything she'd learned at Quantico, every principle drilled into her, screamed that he was manipulating her, that this was an elaborate justification for evil. But the evidence— "The Hernandez cartel," she said suddenly, remembering. "Last year, 15 dead in a warehouse fire in Guadalajara. Official investigation said rival gang violence. I set that fire. No hesitation, no remorse. They were experimenting with weaponized fentanyl, planning to deploy it in school zones as a terror tactic, create demand through addiction in children." His eyes met hers, unflinching. "I would do it again without hesitation." "You can't just decide who lives and dies," Mara said, but the conviction in her voice wavered. "Someone has to." Gatto stood, moving toward her with predatory grace. "Your system is designed to protect the innocent, but it's been corrupted to protect the powerful. While you gather evidence and wait for warrants, children disappear, women are sold, poison floods the streets. I don't have the luxury of due process." "This is insane." Mara pressed her palms against her eyes. "I'm an FBI agent. You're everything I'm supposed to stop. Are you supposed to stop the man who eliminated the Markov network before they could auction 20 kidnapped girls to the highest bidder?" His voice softened. "Or are you supposed to stop evil, whatever form it takes, whatever methods are necessary. The question hung between them like a blade. Mara had spent her entire career seeing the world in black and white criminals and law enforcement, guilty and innocent, wrong and right. But Gatto had painted her world in shades of gray, so dark they approached black, yet somehow refracted light. "I need time," she whispered. "Time is the one thing we have in abundance." He moved back to the fire, giving her space. "Think, Mara. Use that brilliant mind. Investigate my claims if we get rescued. You'll find I'm telling the truth." Mara sank to the ground, her body suddenly exhausted. She'd fallen in love with a killer. But what if that killer was saving more lives than her entire career ever would? What if the man she'd hunted for 15 months was the hero, and she'd been serving a system too broken to see it? The fire crackled between them, and in its dancing light, Mara Murphy felt the last foundations of her certainty crumble into ash. The island holds more secrets, and Mara's choice will define both their fates. Subscribe to continue reading, as duty collides with desire in the most dangerous way possible. The confession came at dawn, when the jungle mist still clung to the trees like secrets refusing to dissipate. Mara had spent the night staring at the shelter's woven ceiling, Gatto's revelations churning through her mind like a storm that wouldn't break. He slept fitfully beside her, his breathing occasionally hitching with the remnants of fever, and she'd watched him with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile two impossible truths. When his eyes opened, catching the first light, she knew she couldn't carry the deception any longer. "I need to tell you something," Mara said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "The whole truth this time." Gatto sat up slowly, his expression guarded. "I'm listening. My name is Special Agent Mara Murphy, FBI Organized Crime Division." The words came out clinical, professional, a shield against the vulnerability underneath. "I've been assigned to your case for 15 months. I boarded that plane specifically to track you. My entire cover, Emma Walsh, marine biologist, the conference in Singapore, all of it was constructed to get close to you, to gather evidence, to finally bring you in." The silence that followed was deafening. Mara watched emotions flicker across Gatto's face: surprise, hurt, anger, and something that looked devastatingly like resignation. 15 months, he repeated softly. "All that time, you were hunting me." "Yes." She refused to look away, refused to soften the blow. "I had files on you that detailed every known associate, every suspected crime, every pattern of movement. I memorized your voice from surveillance recordings. I studied your psychology, your tactics, your weaknesses. I was the agent closest to finally catching you." Gatto stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of their small clearing, his back rigid with tension. "And everything here? The survival, the partnership, He stopped, his shoulders rising and falling with a sharp breath. "The kiss. Was that part of your investigation too?" "No." The word ripped from her throat. "God, no. That was real. Everything since the crash has been real. How am I supposed to believe that?" He spun to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his control had completely shattered. "You're trained to deceive, to manipulate, to make targets trust you so you can destroy them. Maybe this is all just an extended interrogation technique. Gain my confidence? Make me confess? Use my feelings against me. If that's what you believe, then leave." Mara stood, her voice breaking despite her attempt at composure. "Walk away right now. Survive this island alone. Because I can't, I won't defend myself against your suspicion when I've spent my entire adult life earning the right to that suspicion." They stared at each other across the clearing. 15 months of cat and mouse collapsed into this single moment of brutal honesty. "I was supposed to hate you," Mara continued, tears she'd never allowed herself, finally spilling free. "You were the case that would define my career, the monster I'd bring to justice, proof that a first-generation immigrant from Cork could rise to the top of the bureau." Her voice cracked. "But you're not a monster. You're a man who carries impossible weight and makes terrible choices in service of something larger than himself. And I—" "Don't," Gatto warned, his own voice rough with emotion. "I love you." The words hung between them like a confession and a condemnation. "I love you, and it's destroying everything I thought I was. My career, my principles, my certainty about right and wrong. You've dismantled me more thoroughly than I ever could have dismantled your operation." Gatto closed his eyes, and she saw the war raging behind them, self-preservation against something more dangerous. When he opened them again, the anger had transformed into something that looked like grief. "You should have let me believe the lie," he said quietly. "It would have been kinder." "I couldn't. Not after what you shared with me. Not after." Mara's breath hitched. "You trusted me with your truth. I owed you mine, even if it costs me everything." For a long moment, Gatto stood frozen, processing, calculating, deciding. Then, with the same decisive movement he brought to everything, he crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. "You're an idiot," he muttered against her hair, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A brilliant, beautiful, honorable idiot. You're staying?" Disbelief colored her words. "Where else would I go?" He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with devastating gentleness. "You think I don't recognize the sacrifice you're making? Telling me the truth knowing it might drive me away, knowing it means choosing me over everything you've worked for?" "I can't go back," Mara whispered, the reality finally, fully settling over her. "Even if we're rescued, even if I never see you again after this island, I can't go back to who I was, to believing the world is as simple as guilty and innocent. Then we're both traitors." Gatto's thumb traced the path of her tears. "I betrayed my father's legacy. You're betraying your oath. We're perfectly matched in our ruin." "This is insane," Mara said, but she was already leaning into his touch, already accepting the impossible choice she'd made. "Everything about us is insane." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips gentle and fierce and claiming, "But I choose this insanity. I choose you, Mara Murphy. Even knowing what you are, what you were sent to do. Even knowing this will end in fire." Mara kissed him back with all the desperate certainty of someone who'd just burned their entire world to ash and found, impossibly, that she didn't regret it. She'd crossed an ocean of morality to reach this man, and there was no going back. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist, revealing the jungle in all its dangerous beauty. And in that clearing, an FBI agent and a criminal king held each other like drowning victims who'd found their only anchor in the storm. The rain came again that night, but this time neither of them sought shelter from the storm. Gatto's hands found her in the darkness, and Mara stopped running from the inevitable. The kiss deepened, transforming from comfort into something more primal, more necessary. Mara's hands found the fabric of Gatto's shirt, tugging it over his head with urgent need. He responded in kind, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine, memorizing every line of her body as if this moment might be their last. "Are you certain?" he murmured against her throat, his self-control barely contained. "Once we cross this line." "We crossed every line the moment that plane went down." Mara pulled him closer, her lips finding his with fierce certainty. "I'm done pretending I don't want this. Don't want you." They moved together with the desperate intensity of two people who'd spent too long denying what burned between them. Gatto's touch was reverent despite the urgency, his hands exploring her body with the careful attention he brought to everything, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch against him, what made her whisper his name like a prayer and a curse combined. Mara gave herself over to sensation, to the heat of his skin against hers, to the way their bodies fit together as perfectly as their survival instincts had. Every kiss tasted like defiance. Every caress felt like choosing chaos over order, passion over duty. When they finally came together, it was with the shattering recognition that they'd irrevocably changed each other, that neither would emerge from this island as the person they'd been before. Afterward, they lay tangled in each other, breathing hard, the jungle's sounds a distant backdrop to their shared heartbeat. Gatto traced idle patterns on her shoulder, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "I never thought," he began, but the words died as a sound cut through the afternoon stillness. Voices, distant but distinct, and they weren't speaking English. Gatto was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from lover to predator in a heartbeat. He handed Mara her clothes with efficient silence, then moved to the edge of their clearing, listening with lethal focus. "How many?" Mara whispered, dressing quickly, her FBI training overriding everything else. "At least 4, maybe more." His jaw clenched, armed, judging by the sound. "They're searching for something. Or someone." Mara's mind raced. "The island isn't uninhabited." "No." Gatto's expression turned grim. "And we just announced our presence with that smoke signal from our fire." The voices grew closer, accompanied now by the sound of machetes cutting through undergrowth. Mara caught fragments of conversation, a dialect she didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Aggressive. Territorial. Dangerous. "We need to hide," she said. But Gatto was already shaking his head. "Too late. They're tracking our trail directly to this clearing. They've probably been watching us for days." He turned to her, his dark eyes hard with decision. "When they arrive, stay behind me. Let me handle this. I'm not some civilian who needs protecting." "Mara." He gripped her shoulders, his intensity absolute. "These aren't law enforcement. They're not criminals playing by rules, you understand. This is survival in its rawest form. Please, trust me." The voices burst into their clearing before she could respond. 5 men, weathered and hardened by island living, armed with machetes and makeshift weapons. Their leader, a scarred man with eyes that held too much violence, assessed them with the calculating gaze of someone who saw only resources or threats. He spoke in rapid, harsh syllables, gesturing at their shelter, their supplies, at Mara specifically. She didn't need translation to understand the threat. Gatto responded in what sounded like a mix of Spanish and another language, his posture non-threatening but alert. The negotiation was brief and brutal in its clarity. The leader laughed, said something that made his companions grin, and took a step toward Mara. Everything happened in 3 seconds. Gatto moved with a speed that defied his recent injury, closing the distance and driving his palm into the leader's throat with surgical precision. The man dropped, gasping, and Gatto had his machete before the body hit the ground. The nearest attacker swung, and Gatto deflected with the efficiency of someone who trained for exactly this kind of violence, brutal, economical, designed to end threats permanently. "Mara, left," he shouted, and instinct overrode her shock. She grabbed a heavy branch and swung at the man, circling behind Gatto, connecting with his temple hard enough to drop him. No hesitation, no moral crisis. Just the immediate recognition that survival required violence, and she would deliver it. Gatto dispatched the second attacker with a movement too fast to track, then wheeled on the third, who was already backing away. Hands raised, he spoke rapidly, and the remaining 2 men fled into the jungle, abandoning their fallen. The clearing fell silent except for their ragged breathing and the gurgling sounds of the dying leader. Gatto knelt beside him, spoke something in his ear, last rites or warning. Mara couldn't tell, then ended his suffering with swift mercy. When he stood, his hands were bloody, his expression carved from stone. This was the man from the files, ruthless, lethal, capable of extreme violence without flinching. But instead of horror, Mara felt only grim acceptance. "Are you hurt?" she asked, checking him for injuries with professional detachment. "No." He looked at her, searching for disgust or fear. "Mara, you saved our lives." She took his bloodied hand in hers, unflinching. "You did what was necessary. What I would have done if I'd been trained for it. This is who I am," Gatto said quietly. "This is what I do. Not just to monsters in suits, but to anyone who threatens what's mine. There's no court, no jury, no appeals process, just survival." Mara looked at the bodies, at the blood, at the brutal efficiency of the violence she'd just witnessed and participated in. A week ago, she would have arrested him on the spot. Now, she understood with crystalline clarity that the world contained evils her badge couldn't touch, and sometimes the only answer was a harder kind of justice. "I know who you are," she said, stepping closer, not away. "And I'm still here." She'd crossed a line she could never uncross, and she'd do it again without hesitation. The helicopter's distant thrum reached them on the 18th day, a mechanical heartbeat that promised salvation and demanded sacrifice. Mara felt Gatto tense beside her, his hand tightening around hers as they stood at the edge of the clearing they'd widened for exactly this purpose. "It's time," she said quietly, and the weight of those 2 words carried everything they'd become to each other. They'd spent the previous night planning with the same tactical precision they'd brought to survival, only now they were plotting against rescue instead of praying for it. Gatto had offered to disappear into the jungle immediately, to spare her the choice. But Mara had refused. She would control this narrative. She would protect him the way he'd protected her. The Coast Guard helicopter circled twice before landing, and Mara watched her former life descend in a whirlwind of rotor wash and official concern. 2 paramedics emerged first, then Agent Derek Brennan, her partner of 3 years, his face a mixture of relief and professional assessment. "Murphy." Brennan crossed the clearing in quick strides, pulling her into a brief, awkward hug. "Jesus Christ. We thought you were dead. The plane went down 17 days ago." We've been searching. His eyes found Gatto, and his entire demeanor shifted. Gattuso Hawk. This is Marco Vitale, Mara said smoothly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Another passenger. We're the only survivors. Brennan's hand moved toward his weapon, years of training making the gesture automatic. Murphy, that's not. I know who you think he is, Mara interrupted, stepping between them with calculated casualness. I thought the same thing initially. But I've spent 17 days with this man, Brennan. I've seen his passport, his credentials. He's an import consultant from Milan. He just happens to bear an unfortunate resemblance to someone on our wanted list. She watched Brennan's eyes narrow, saw him processing the discrepancy between protocol and her unusual insistence. Behind her, Gatto remained silent, letting her orchestrate their survival with the same trust he'd shown when she'd revealed her true identity. His passport was destroyed in the crash, Mara continued, her tone professionally apologetic, but I can confirm his identity. Marco Vitale, age 42, born in Palermo, currently residing in Milan. He runs a legitimate export business specializing in textiles and wines. It was a cover identity she'd discovered in his effects during their second week, an emergency alias so perfectly constructed it would withstand surface-level scrutiny. Gatto had revealed it to her during one of their late-night conversations, a gesture of trust that had meant more than any words. Brennan's jaw tightened. I need to run his prints. Of course, Mara said easily. Standard procedure. But I'm telling you, you're wasting resources chasing a resemblance. The paramedics approached, and Mara allowed them to check her injuries while keeping Brennan in her peripheral vision. She recounted the crash with perfect detail. The mechanical failure, the impact, the grim discovery that only she and Marco had survived. She described their 18 days with clinical precision. The shelter construction, the water sources, the wildlife threats, the attack by island inhabitants 3 days prior that had forced them to defend themselves. You killed 5 men? Brennan's skepticism was palpable. 3, Mara corrected. Marco killed 3 in self-defense. I incapacitated 2. They were armed with machetes, and they made their intentions clear. It was us or them. She met his eyes steadily. I stand by the necessity of the force used. While the paramedics worked, Mara watched the fingerprint scanner being prepared. This was the moment of truth. Either Gatto's alias would hold, or it would shatter, and she'd have to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. Gatto submitted to the fingerprinting with calm cooperation, his expression neutral, almost bored. The agent running the scanner frowned at the results, ran them again, then shook his head. No hits, he told Brennan. System shows Marco Vitale, Italian national, clean record, no outstanding warrants. Mara felt her breath release slowly, carefully, showing nothing of the relief flooding through her. Gatto had prepared for this moment years ago, had built contingencies upon contingencies. The fingerprints in the system belonged to the real Marco Vitale, a willing participant in the deception, she assumed, or perhaps a victim whose identity had been carefully assumed. Either way, the alias held. Brennan wasn't satisfied. Murphy, I need to speak with you privately. They walked to the far edge of the clearing, and Mara prepared for the interrogation she'd known was coming. What the hell is going on? Brennan kept his voice low but fierce. That is Gattuso Hawk. I've seen enough surveillance footage to recognize him. Physical resemblance isn't evidence, Mara countered. You know that. And I've spent more time with this man than anyone on our team ever has. If he were Hawk, I'd know. Would you? Brennan's eyes searched hers. Or has 17 days of survival bonding compromised your judgment? Stockholm Syndrome is real, Murphy. It's not a weakness to admit. I'm not compromised, Mara said coldly. I'm telling you, as your partner and as an agent who's dedicated her career to this case, that man is not Gattuso Hawk. He's a civilian who survived a nightmare, same as me. The lie came easily now, smooth as silk, polished by necessity. She'd crossed the threshold 3 nights ago, when she'd chosen Gatto over her oath, and there was no walking it back. Brennan studied her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant he decided to trust her, or at least to not push further in front of witnesses. We'll debrief properly when we get you home. Full report, psychological evaluation, the works. Of course. Mara returned to the paramedics, allowing them to guide her toward the helicopter. Gatto Marco Vitale, she reminded herself, stood near the aircraft, and when their eyes met, She saw everything he couldn't say. Gratitude, love, acknowledgement of what she'd sacrificed for him. And beneath it all, the knowledge that this was goodbye. The paramedics helped her into the helicopter, and she watched as they did the same for Gatto. He'd be taken to a different facility for medical evaluation, then released when his identity checked out. They'd probably never see each other again, at least not openly, not in any way that mattered to the people they'd been before the crash. As the helicopter lifted off, Mara looked down at the island that had become both prison and paradise, the place where Special Agent Mara Murphy had died, and someone else had been born from the ashes. Brennan sat beside her, already making calls, coordinating their return. He didn't see the way she turned her face to the window, pressing her fingers against the glass as the jungle receded below. He didn't notice the small, folded piece of fabric she'd hidden in her pocket, a torn section of Gatto's shirt that still carried his scent. The helicopter banked east, toward civilization, toward debriefings and reports and the life she'd left behind. But Mara Murphy was no longer the woman who'd boarded that doomed flight 17 days ago. That woman had believed in absolutes, in the clear division between right and wrong, criminal and law enforcement, duty and desire. The woman leaving the island understood that morality operated in shades of gray so dark they approached black, and sometimes love meant betraying everything you'd sworn to uphold. She'd traded her badge for a criminal king's life, her certainty for moral ambiguity, her career for 18 days of truth in a jungle that had stripped away every pretense. As the island disappeared behind them, Mara allowed herself one last thought of Gatto free, alive, continuing his dark crusade against darker evils. She'd never know if she'd made the right choice. She only knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. The helicopter carried her toward home, but home was an illusion now. She'd left her heart on an island with a man she could never acknowledge, pursuing a justice the law would never recognize, loving a criminal who'd somehow become her hero. And she would live with that contradiction for the rest of her life. Did Mara and Gatto's impossible love story captivate you? Their journey doesn't end here. The consequences of Mara's choice are just beginning to unfold, and the dangerous world Gatto fights against won't stay quiet for long. Like and share this story if you felt the weight of Mara's impossible choice. Subscribe now so you don't miss part 2, where the real cost of love and betrayal comes due. Because when you choose a criminal king over your badge, the universe always collects its debt. What happens when the past catches up? Stick with us and find out.